Are you wondering if you're working in a bad organization and whether or not it's time for you to go or whether you should stay? Well, stick around as we explore some considerations that might help to inform your decision making. Hey, welcome back to this week's On the Level Leadership. So, are you working for a bad organization? Okay, well, if that's the case, I got a few questions for you. The first one is, how do you define a bad organization? Is it that the culture is somewhat toxic and it seems to be deteriorating by the minute? Are people leaving in droves like rats off a sinking ship? Well, let's talk about the toxicity piece first, and then we'll look at some performance issues that maybe you might be wondering whether you want to stay in an organization or not. The first is toxicity. When we talk about toxicity in a culture, we talk about, things like employee infighting, political infighting, management abuses, everything from, bullying to harassment to intimidation and even the use of threatening language or even the use of intimidation practices through physicality. It might be as simple as being micromanaged in every step of the work that you're doing. If in fact your assessment after having done a bit of a review of your culture and your organization that you're currently in is showing to be very toxic in nature, then it might be best right off the cuff to consider leaving the organization altogether, because you're going to have to ask yourself some serious questions of whether or not you want to stay and argue for what's best, or whether or not you just want to save your sanity and sort of jet like everybody else who's sort of jumped off the ship has done prior to you. I would argue that taking a little bit less money in one organization and working in a place that feels safe and where you can succeed is probably better than getting paid a bit more or maybe even a lot more in an organization, but yet being abused and having your self-worth being attacked on a daily basis. Having lived a toxic environment myself and having been at the front end of career-limiting conversations with people who were very abusive towards me, it's really just not worth the extra hassle, and it's really not worth your health and your well-being to have to put up with toxicity in any way, shape, or form, no matter how much you're getting paid. So if your environment's not a toxic one, maybe you have really great relationships with the people that you work with. It's not really a bad place to work overall, but what you're finding is that there seems to be a lack of performance, a lack of drive, a lack of vision, maybe even a lack of competence. Some clear signs that your organization is actually struggling with some performance issues might include things like constant firefighting or needing to constantly put out the day's emergencies. I have a saying, and we have a saying in emergency management, where poor planning does not constitute an emergency on my part. Firefighting is a clear signal that maybe there's an issue with the organization's overall performance. The lack of proper assessment of your status, where you are versus your goals, and when I say I mean the organizational goals, and a lack of ongoing improvement processes like think Kaizen. If there's a lack of that, then you're in an organization that maybe doesn't have the best improvement / ongoing, ever-evolving nature. In other words, it's not a learning environment. Senge speaks to this at great length about how important it is to be a learning organization, to constantly be striving to learn, adapt, recycle, rejig, course correct, and continue to move and improve as you go through the cycles of business so that you continue to find new and fresh ways to increase your performance and ultimately increase your bottom line. There might also be an inability or a lack of desirability to course correct, so a lot of rigidity. Maybe your organizational leaders are dogmatic in how they want to approach things. Maybe they're not willing to shift or change perspectives, and they're very unwilling to hear any kind of critiquing. That is also a sign, a clear signal of an organization that is unwilling to learn, and that can be very problematic from a performance perspective. Or alternatively, maybe the culture is pretty good. People you work with are decent. The overall executive group of people seem to be on point. They seem to have clear direction for the company or for the organization you're working for, but you happen to be directly reporting to what we like to call an absentee leader. What is an absentee leader? Well, the Harvard Business Review has an excellent article on the absentee leader, and I've left the link for that article down below because it has some really great information in it. Essentially, it's defined as the most common form of incompetent leadership that you will find in organizations. Absentee leaders can actually leave their teams feeling more stressed because they feel that lack of engagement or that lack of vision gives them absolutely zero direction. It leaves them basically leaderless, and without that direction, they have no sense of what their role is within the organization, and they can't see themselves in the bigger picture. That creates a lot of stress and a sense of vulnerability from the employee's perspective because they're not set up to succeed and they feel like they're going to fail. And maybe, if cuts were to come down the pipe, they would be one of the first teams to be cut because their value is just not clear. The other part of absentee leaders, unfortunately, is that you will often get team leaders who will assume leadership. I hate to compare human beings to dogs, but let's be frank, we are an animal. And, what will happen is if the lead dog is not assuming the lead, then a dog in the pack will assume that lead. And unfortunately, what often happens is you have a leader that's ill-equipped to lead, or maybe leads in a way that is ineffective. So you'll have leaders that will sometimes step in that will maybe they themselves be more of a bully maybe in their approach, maybe be a bit more aggressive, trying to get things done or trying to make sure that the team is successful. If you have the right leader that steps up, great. But if you have a secondary leader that steps up that isn't so great, then it can actually add to the toxicity piece of an organization overall. So depending on how you've assessed your organization and how bad you've determined the organization to be, there's a couple of things that you're going to need to consider. One is, what influence do you have to affect any change in the organization you're in? Do you have the leadership skill sets, or do you have the influence to be able to support or drive a change initiative that might help to drive either the performance or improve the culture of your organization? What changes do you have the ability to make broadly, and what changes do you have within your own scope of practice or your own scope of control within your team or your unit? So when I was a leader in the federal government in Canada of a particular group of people, I remember when I first joined that team, the team was very toxic. There was a lot of discordant sort of beliefs. There was a lot of frustration. There were a few labor relations complaints. It was a pretty messy environment to take on. Now, working in a federal context in a big bureaucracy, you're not going to change the big picture. It's like trying to change the Titanic's course. You just can't do it. But what you can do as a leader and what you can do within your own environment is look at what you have control over. And at that time, I had full control over that particular team, and I had control over the operations of that team. And so I was able to apply Coos and Posner's principles from the Leadership Challenge, which I have the link down below for that book if you're interested, and actually saw very positive results with respect to the culture, the dynamic. I was able to establish trust. We were able to make some really good changes at the unit level that was able to make that group at that time much more performant. They were more engaged in corporate activities. We really saw a shift. So what do you bring to the table that can help affect the changes that you'd like to see in your organization? And do you have the influence to do that? In the absence of your own capacity to lead change, what access do you have to decision makers or influencers within that organization? So the decision makers of any organization typically are the senior executives. That's your CEO, your CFOs, your COOs, your vice presidents. So they are the people that have the ability to make those big strategic decisions. Whereas influencers have the decision makers' ears. So it could be anything from your executive assistants that give you access to one of the leaders in the organization. They could also be HR directors or client service leads. So just keep your mind open and take a look at who the influencers are and can they help to drive your agenda of change if that's something you want to do. So if you do have access to these folks and you have the opportunity to speak to them, you can't go and just complain, because the last thing that executives or senior managers want to hear from people is a series of complaints. Nobody wants to hear that. They want to hear, okay, there's a critique or an observation, and here's my action plan to help address that particular issue. Even before you get into the office with these people, you need to have a clear strategy on how you want to approach them. Understand who you're talking to and the level of information that they're going to want. And, if you need to get some coaching, either from a mentor, colleague, a real coach, whatever, to help you kind of situate yourself and get yourself organized and have an action plan drafted and a clear sense of how you want to speak to this particular person around this issue, that'll really go a long way. So you look prepared, you go in with confidence, you express your concerns, you propose possible solutions, and remember that you may be shot down. There may be an opportunity for you to speak to them, but at the end of the day, if the decision maker doesn't like what you hear, then you might be shot down and you may be asked to not come back with that proposal again. Or maybe they'll meet you halfway and say, well, I don't entirely agree with your observation. I've seen these things, or I've heard of these things, or my metrics I'm fine with, but what I will do is I'll meet you in the middle and maybe I'll allow you to do XYZ from your proposal. So you might meet in the middle ground from what you're proposing. But either way, if you really have the desire to make changes in your organization, that's certainly something you can think about. Or if the culture simply does not allow you to do that. So again, in a heavily bureaucratic environment, and I would say large organizations are very bureaucratic and have very hierarchical ways of accessing the senior management. For example, a client service director may or may not have access to the CEO, right? It might not be a culturally approved thing that you just go talk to the CEO whenever you can book time in their calendar. You may have to go through a series of managers to get endorsement on anything before it touches the CEO's desk. So it's like that in a federal context where you just don't go above your managers to get to the VP, for example, to complain about the culture of an organization. That's just not how it's done. So if the culture simply doesn't allow you to propose your potential changes at the higher level to drive performance or efficiency, then you might want to consider, okay, maybe this is an opportunity for me to take my talents elsewhere. The big thing here and the big lesson learned in all of this is that you should go where your talents and your gifts are observed, where they're valued, where they're rewarded, right? And stop trying to please an organization or the managers in an organization that undervalue you, or where your core values and the values of that particular organizations are misaligned. Because if you can't see eye to eye on how things are working or how things are being done, then there's really no value in you being there. So if you're miserable and you're tired and you're exhausted at the end of every day, and you feel like you're not valued, your opinion doesn't matter, and it doesn't seem to matter what you bring to the table, whether it's good or bad, is ever heard or ever considered, then maybe it's time you do think about bringing your talents elsewhere. It may not be worth what I call your self-equity to continue investing in a lost cause, right? So it might be best at that point to keep looking elsewhere and to see where you can apply your talents. Like your gut feelings or your intuition can really serve you well. I have felt in my life that when I didn't listen to my intuition, it's usually when I got in the most trouble. So if it doesn't feel right, it usually isn't. Finally, the other thing is you can also get sucked into the negativity of the organization. And I am guilty of that 100%, where you might start to exhibit poor leadership practices. You get into the downward spiral of gossiping, of talking badly about people in your organization, of being pissed off all the time about things, using an angry, frustrated tone, crossing the line from assertion to aggression. When you use these kinds of different, I would say less than favorable leadership practices, what that does is you lose the trust of those that you're trying to help. Getting into these kinds of leadership practices will degrade your leadership skills, and you will really lose the respect of others, but more important, you'll lose your own self-respect, because you'll know when you look back on it sort of where you crossed the line and sort of went to the dark side of leadership. So it's never easy to make decisions around whether you should stay in an organization or leave in an organization. I have been through this myself. I get it, especially when you've spent a long time somewhere. Like I spent 18 years in a particular location, and it was only when I left that I realized, my gosh, I needed to leave. But when you've spent a good part of your career investing in a location, investing in relationships, you've moved up maybe in an organization and you feel like you have great relationships that might help you to get continually promoted. The reality is if the organization really is a troubled place to work and are unwilling to listen to your constructive criticism around either the culture or the performance, and are unwilling to shift or evolve, then it is probably time for you to think about leaving and growing elsewhere and being nurtured elsewhere so you can grow in your career and in your leadership acumen. Well, I hope that this video was helpful for you. I know that sometimes it's not easy to make these decisions of whether to stay or whether to leave organizations, but ultimately toxicity is bad and your gut feeling always rules in my mind. So thanks again for watching On the Level Leadership. See you next week.